My brother looked at me and said, "We didn't order for your son," then handed him a cheap hot dog while everyone else ate $120 steaks. I smiled and told him enjoy that steak because it would be the last. My name is Victoria Mercer Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and the night my family handed my 11-year-old son a cold hot dog while their children ate $120 steaks, I finally stopped protecting the people who had spent years humiliating us. "We didn't order for your son," my brother said, pushing a paper tray across the white tablecloth as though he were feeding a stray animal outside a gas station. Beside him, his 2 children were into filet mignon and choosing desserts from a silver cart. My mother barely looked up. "You should have packed him something," she added. My son stared at the hot dog, then quietly folded his award certificate beneath his chair so no one would spill sauce on it. That certificate was the reason we were there. He had just won the Young Infrastructure Innovator Award for designing a low-cost flood warning device, yet my family had turned the celebration into another ceremony honoring themselves. I smiled at my brother and said, "Noted." He mistook my calmness for surrender. What he didn't know was that I had spent the previous 4 months auditing the construction company he believed would soon belong entirely to him. He also didn't know what was inside the blue folder beneath my chair, or why the foundation's board members had been invited to our private dining room. When the waiter returned and asked whether he should clear the unused place setting beside me, I lifted my glass and announced that before dessert was served, everyone needed to hear why my brother would no longer be running our family company by morning. The room went silent. Before I tell you exactly what I revealed, and what happened after my brother realized he had humiliated the one person who could expose him, tell me what time is it, where you are, and where are you watching from? I'd love to know how far this story travels. The dinner was being held inside the Hawthorne Rail Museum, a century-old station that had recently been converted into one of the most exclusive event venues in Western Pennsylvania. Mercer Civic Development, the construction company my father founded, had overseen the restoration. My brother Grant Mercer had treated the project as his personal monument from the beginning. His photograph appeared in the museum brochure, his name was engraved on a brass donor wall, and that evening he moved between tables accepting praise for saving a piece of American history. What the guests didn't know was that I had found structural discrepancies, altered invoices, and payments routed through subcontractors that appeared to exist only on paper. I worked as a forensic construction auditor, which meant companies usually hired me after a project had gone wrong. My job was to determine whether the failure came from incompetence, fraud, or both. My father had asked me to review the museum project discreetly after the insurance carrier questioned several cost increases. Grant believed I was merely helping organize documents before the annual board meeting. He had no idea my preliminary report was already more than 200 pages long. Liam's award ceremony had taken place in the museum auditorium that afternoon. His device used inexpensive soil sensors and recycled phone components to warn rural communities when drainage channels were approaching dangerous levels. He had built the prototype after our neighborhood flooded 2 summers earlier. While other children ran outside to watch the water rise, Liam sat beside an elderly neighbor who was terrified her basement would fill before her oxygen equipment could be moved. That experience stayed with him. For 8 months, he tested sensors in buckets, gutters, and muddy drainage ditches until his system worked. The Regional Engineering Foundation selected him from more than 600 students. Grant's children had entered the same competition with a professionally assembled miniature bridge. They received participation medals. Grant smiled for photographs, but I noticed the muscles tighten along his jaw when Liam's name was announced as the overall winner. At the family dinner afterward, Grant had arranged a printed menu with 4 courses. His children ordered filet mignon. My parents ordered sea bass. Grant's wife Mallory selected lamb, then spent 10 minutes discussing which wine paired best with it. Liam waited patiently for someone to take his order. When the waiter reached him, Grant raised one hand. "He's not on the package." I assumed it was a mistake and asked the waiter to add a meal. Grant leaned back and said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "We didn't order for your son." Then he signaled to an employee who returned with a hot dog wrapped in paper. My mother Diane told me I should have packed Liam food because children can be picky. My father Robert stared at his plate. He had seen Grant belittle me before, but silence had become his preferred method of avoiding responsibility. Liam whispered that he wasn't hungry. I knew that tone. It was the voice he used when he wanted to make himself smaller, so adults would stop arguing. I asked Grant why every other child had been included in the dinner package. He shrugged, because their parents confirmed the proper reservation. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email in which I had confirmed 2 seats and selected Liam's meal 3 weeks earlier. Grant glanced at it and said, "Then the venue must have lost it." The waiter's expression changed. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but Grant dismissed him with a flick of his fingers. That tiny gesture told me the exclusion hadn't been accidental. Grant had changed the seating instructions himself. He wanted Liam to understand that winning an award did not grant him equal status in our family. More importantly, he wanted to remind me that inside the Mercer name, he still decided who belonged. I looked at the blue folder beneath my chair. Until that moment, I had planned to give my father the report privately after dinner. I had intended to protect the company's employees, reduce public embarrassment, and give Grant one opportunity to resign before the board became involved. Then Liam quietly asked whether he could eat his hot dog in the hallway so he wouldn't embarrass anyone. Something inside me became perfectly still. No, I told him. You're staying right here. I placed the paper tray in the center of the table, looked at Grant, and said, "Noted." Across from me, he smiled because he thought he had won. When the waiter returned, I asked him to leave the unused place setting exactly where it was. Grant laughed and told me not to create a symbolic tragedy over processed meat. Several relatives smiled nervously. They had spent years responding to his cruelty as if it were clever humor because challenging him required more courage than laughing along. I stood and tapped my spoon against my glass once. The sound carried farther than I expected. Conversations at the adjoining donor tables faded. My father frowned and asked what I was doing. "Correcting the guest list," I said. Grant told me to sit down. I looked toward the doorway where 3 members of the Mercer Civic Development Board had entered with Naomi Clark, the company's outside compliance attorney. I had asked them to arrive at 8 o'clock, though I had not told my family why. Naomi carried a locked document case. Grant's smile disappeared. I introduced Liam as the winner of the foundation's Young Infrastructure Innovator Award and asked the room to applaud him before we discussed anything else. The applause started uncertainly, then strengthened when several foundation representatives stood. Liam looked at me with wide eyes. For the first time that evening, the adults were acknowledging why we had gathered. Grant interrupted before the applause ended. "This is a private family dinner," Naomi answered from the doorway. "It stopped being private when company funds paid for it." Mallory lowered her wine glass. My mother looked at Grant, then at me, as though hoping one of us would announce that this was a joke. I opened the blue folder and held up the event invoice. Mercer Civic Development had been charged $18,400 for the dinner, including premium meals for 26 people. The company had also been charged for 2 children who were not present, a champagne reception that never occurred, and an executive accommodation suite listed under Grant's name. Yet Liam's confirmed meal had been manually removed from the final seating plan. I asked the banquet manager to explain who authorized the change. A woman near the back stood and said Grant had emailed the revision that morning. She had retained the message because he also instructed her to charge Liam's original meal to the corporate account while serving him the cheapest food available. Grant's face darkened. "This is ridiculous." "It was a harmless joke." "A joke creates laughter," I said. This created an invoice discrepancy. I then announced that my audit had uncovered more than a bad dinner charge. Over the previous 18 months, Grant had approved nearly $900,000 in payments to 3 subcontracting firms connected to a former college roommate. 2 firms had no employees, no equipment, and no active licenses. The third billed the museum project for specialized waterproofing that laboratory tests showed had never been installed. Grant pushed back his chair so violently that it struck the wall. He accused me of stealing confidential documents. Naomi explained that the board had authorized my access and that copies had already been preserved by independent counsel. My father's complexion turned gray. He asked whether the missing waterproofing posed a safety risk. I told him the building was not in immediate danger, but parts of the lower archive could flood during a severe storm. The repair estimate was at least $400,000. Grant said cost overruns were normal and insisted the subcontractors had performed a legitimate consulting work. I placed 3 photographs on the table. Each showed the same empty storefront used as the registered address for all 3 firms. Then I displayed a timeline of payments, including transfers made within 48 hours of Grant purchasing a lake house through a limited liability company. My mother whispered his name. Mallory stared at him as if she had never seen him before. He turned on me and said, "You're destroying this family because your kid didn't get steak." I looked at Liam's untouched hot dog. "No, the hot dog only showed me that you still believe taking from someone counts as winning." I announced that, effective immediately. I was withdrawing my professional certification from every report Grant had submitted under my name. Years earlier, he had persuaded me to sign a limited technical review agreement, claiming the documents would be used only for internal bids. My audit showed he had copied my signature block onto at least 7 public financing applications. Without verified certification, those applications had to be re-examined. The board chair stepped forward and informed Grant that his executive authority was suspended pending investigation. His building access financial permissions and company devices would be disabled before he left the museum. No one spoke. Grant looked around the room waiting for my parents to rescue him. For once, neither of them moved. Grant recovered from the shock by doing what he had always done when cornered. He rewrote history. He told the board I had resented him since childhood and claimed my audit was revenge for being overlooked. He reminded everyone that I had left Mercer Civic Development 12 years earlier after an emotional breakdown. I felt Liam's fingers tighten around mine. Grant had used that phrase for years because it turned a professional betrayal into a personal weakness. "Tell them why you really left," he said. Tell them you couldn't handle working with other people. For a moment, the museum disappeared, and I was 26 again, standing in a temporary project office beside a highway expansion site. I had developed a method for identifying concrete curing defects before visible cracking appeared. The system was not glamorous, but it could save contractors millions in repairs. I presented it to Grant, who was then director of field operations. He praised the work and asked me to send him my complete analysis so he could format it for Dad. 2 weeks later, Grant presented the method to a state transportation panel under his own name. When I confronted him, he produced an email that appeared to show me abandoning the project and admitting my calculations were unreliable. My father removed me from the technical team. Grant received a promotion. I resigned 3 months later. The experience damaged more than my career. My former fiancé Daniel worked for the company's legal department. Grant privately showed him messages suggesting I had fabricated test results and planned to blame Daniel if regulators investigated. Daniel ended our engagement without telling me what he had seen. I spent years believing he had simply stopped loving me when my career became inconvenient. 6 months before the museum dinner, Daniel contacted me after discovering the old files during a server migration. The messages were not mine. Their metadata showed they had been created on Grant's office computer, then forwarded through an administrative account to make them appear authentic. Daniel apologized, but apologies cannot return 12 years. They cannot give back the apartment you sold because you could no longer afford it, the professional references that stopped answering your calls, or the months you spent wondering whether everyone else could see a defect in you that you could not. Still, the files gave me something I had never possessed before: proof. At the dinner, I asked Naomi to open the locked case. She removed a forensic report prepared by an independent cybersecurity firm. Grant laughed too loudly and said no one cared about ancient family arguments. Ethan Mercer, our younger brother, stood from the far end of the table. Ethan had spent most of the evening silent, but his face had changed as I spoke. He was a field engineer for the company and had always believed I left because I hated working with him. "I care," he said. Grant told him to stay out of it. Ethan ignored him and admitted that Grant had used the same strategy against him 3 years earlier. After Ethan questioned a drainage calculation on a municipal project, an anonymous complaint accused him of reporting to work intoxicated. The allegation was disproved, but he lost his role as project lead. Grant later took over the contract. Ethan had never connected the incident to my departure because Grant kept us isolated, giving each of us a different explanation for why the others could not be trusted. Naomi distributed summaries of the digital examination. The report linked Grant's old computer credentials to the forged messages used against me. It also identified recently altered inspection records from the museum project. Grant looked at our father and said the forensic firm was biased because I had hired it. My father asked whether Grant was denying that he presented my concrete analysis as his own. Grant answered, "We were working for the same company. Nothing belongs to one person in a family business." That sentence did more damage than any document. My father had built the company around the idea that family members would protect one another's work. Grant had just admitted that he viewed our work as material he was entitled to claim. My mother finally asked whether he had lied to Daniel. Grant rolled his eyes. She was going to outgrow him anyway. I heard a chair scrape. My mother stood, pressed both hands against the table, and stared at the son she had defended through every accusation. "You let your sister believe she was unlovable for 12 years. Grant replied that everyone was becoming dramatic. My mother removed the gold company pin from her jacket and placed it beside his plate. She had worn that pin at every gala since my father founded the company. "No," she said, "we were negligent. You were deliberate." Grant's expression shifted. Losing the board frightened him, but losing my mother's unquestioning protection terrified him. He pointed at me and shouted that I had manipulated everyone because I could not tolerate his success. Liam rose before I could answer. His voice was quiet, but the room heard every word. "My mom didn't take your success. She found out where you took it from." Grant stared at him. Then he laughed, but this time no one joined him. My father asked the children to leave the room. Grant immediately agreed, assuming the adults would negotiate once Liam and the other kids were gone. I refused to send Liam away as though he were the source of the shame. Instead, Naomi arranged for a foundation coordinator to take all the children to the museum's simulator gallery, where Liam could demonstrate his flood warning prototype. Before he left, I told him none of what happened was his fault. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the paper tray. I promised we would eat somewhere better afterward. Once the doors closed, my father turned to Grant and asked the question he had avoided for years: how much Grant pretended not to understand. My father repeated it. Naomi answered from the audit. The confirmed questionable payments totaled $876,000. Another $1.4 million required supporting documentation that Grant had failed to provide. There were also personal expenses categorized as client development, luxury travel, private school donations made in his children's names, furniture for the lake house, and the dinner taking place around us. Mallory covered her mouth. She said Grant had told her the lake house was purchased with an executive performance bonus. The board chair stated that no such bonus had been approved. Grant turned toward his wife and accused her of humiliating him by asking questions in public. That was when Mallory's shock hardened into anger. She asked whether the accounts he managed for their children's education were real. Grant would not answer. Naomi said those accounts were outside the scope of the company audit. Mallory left the table and called her attorney from the hallway. Grant's power had always depended on controlling information. Within minutes, that control was collapsing in every direction. My father still hesitated. I could see the old instinct fighting inside him, the desire to protect his eldest son, the heir he had introduced to clients since Grant was 22. He asked whether the investigation could remain internal. Naomi explained that public redevelopment grants had funded part of the museum. If invoices were falsified, the board had a legal duty to report the matter to the grant authority and insurance carrier. My father looked at me as though I had created the law simply by uncovering the violation. "Did you have to do this tonight?" he asked. The question hurt, but it did not surprise me. For years, my family had treated the exposure of wrongdoing as more offensive than the wrongdoing itself. I answered that I had planned a private meeting until Grant deliberately excluded Liam from a dinner celebrating Liam's achievement. My father said a child's meal and a corporate investigation were separate issues. They are the same issue, I told him. Grant decides that rules apply only to people he considers less important. He removed Liam's dinner because he could. He removed my name from my work because he could. He removed safety materials from a public project because he believed no one with authority would challenge him. Ethan added that every employee knew Grant rewarded silence and punished questions. He described site supervisors who stopped reporting problems because they feared reassignment. One foreman had resigned after being ordered to approve drainage work he had not inspected. My father listened with his eyes closed. He had spent years claiming he was gradually transferring control to Grant because the company needed decisive leadership. Now he was hearing what decisiveness looked like when accountability disappeared. Grant accused Ethan of jealousy and called me vindictive. He said our father owed him loyalty because he had sacrificed his entire adult life for the business. I reminded him that loyalty was not immunity. Then I asked my parents one of the few questions I had never dared to say aloud. How many people were you willing to let him injure so you could keep believing you raised a perfect son? My mother began to cry. My father's face tightened, but I did not apologize. The question was not cruel. The answer was they had watched Grant claim my work, damage my reputation, sideline Ethan, and ridicule Liam. Each incident alone had been dismissed as competition, misunderstanding, or humor. Together, they formed a system, and my parents had maintained it by demanding peace from the people being harmed. Grant sensed their resistance weakening. He softened his voice and told my mother he had made mistakes because the pressure of preserving Dad's legacy was unbearable. He promised to repay anything that had been miscategorized. He even offered to apologize to Liam. My mother almost responded. Then Naomi placed another document on the table. It was an email sent by Grant 2 days earlier after he learned the board planned to review project costs. In it, he instructed the finance director to delete archived vendor correspondence and suggested blaming the missing waterproofing documentation on Ethan. My mother read the message twice. Grant claimed it had been taken out of context. Ethan asked what context could justify framing him for fraud. Grant had no answer. My father removed the company signet ring he had worn for 34 years and set it on the table. "You're suspended," he said. Grant replied that the board could not remove him because he controlled the largest voting bloc after our father. I opened the final section of my folder. Years earlier, my father had transferred equal non-voting economic shares to all 3 children, but retained voting authority through a family trust. Grant had repeatedly told everyone those votes would become his upon my father's retirement. What Grant did not know was that 6 months earlier, after the insurance inquiry began, my father had appointed me independent trust protector because my professional license required me to remain outside company management. I had the authority to freeze voting transfers when credible evidence of fraud threatened the trust's assets. That afternoon before the award ceremony, I exercised it. Grant did not control the company. He had never controlled it. He had only controlled our fear of confronting him. Grant left the museum without his company phone, laptop access badge, or family. Security escorted him to the parking lot after he tried to enter the administrative office and retrieve files from a desktop computer. The donor dinner ended early. No one touched dessert. I took Liam to a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away where he ordered pancakes, scrambled eggs, and the largest chocolate milkshake on the menu. He asked whether his uncle was going to jail. I told him I did not know and that consequences would be decided by investigators, not by our anger. I also told him that speaking up was not the same as seeking someone's destruction. We had presented facts. Grant's choices would determine what happened next. Over the following weeks, those choices became harder for him to deny. The board hired a national accounting firm to expand my audit. Investigators confirmed that the 3 subcontractors had routed a significant portion of Mercer Civic Development's payments back to an investment company connected to Grant. The missing waterproofing had not been an oversight. Grant had approved a cheaper substitute build the project for the original material and diverted part of the difference. The museum closed its lower archive wing for repairs, though the main building remained safe. The story became public when the Regional Development Authority announced its investigation. I did not speak to reporters. Neither did Liam. Grant, however, gave an interview claiming he was the victim of a family coup led by a disgruntled sister. The strategy failed when the journalist obtained records showing my audit had begun months before the dinner. Former employees then contacted the board. Some described altered inspections. Others produced emails showing that Grant had retaliated against people who questioned invoices. The board terminated him for cause. Because his employment agreement included a misconduct clause, he lost an unvested executive equity grant and a large severance package he had expected to receive when my father retired. The court froze the lake house while attorneys traced the purchase funds. Grant eventually agreed to sell it and place the proceeds in escrow. Mallory filed for legal separation after discovering that he had borrowed against one of their personal accounts without telling her. I felt no pleasure watching their marriage fracture. Their children loved both parents and had done nothing wrong. I made sure Liam understood that we would never mock his cousins or treat them as extensions of their father's behavior. Revenge that targets innocent people merely recreates the original cruelty. My parents struggled with that distinction. My mother called repeatedly asking me to convince the board to let Grant return in a reduced role. She said losing his title house and marriage was already enough. I reminded her that the company employed more than 200 people and built facilities used by the public. Grant's position could not be treated as a family allowance. My father was less direct. He invited me to lunch and suggested that public cooperation with investigators might permanently ruin the Mercer name. I asked whether he wanted to preserve the name or make it worthy of preservation. He did not answer. For the first time, I stopped managing their discomfort. I had spent my adult life translating consequences into gentler language, so my parents would not feel accused. That gentleness had protected Grant more effectively than any lawyer. Ethan became interim director of field operations, but refused the CEO position. He told the board the company needed an external leader with no family allegiance. The board hired Marisol Vega, an infrastructure executive known for rebuilding firms after compliance failures. She created an anonymous reporting system, separated project approval from payment authorization, and ordered independent safety reviews. Employees who had been punished for raising concerns were invited to submit their records. Several received formal apologies and compensation. My father stepped down as chairman. His retirement announcement did not praise Grant or describe the investigation as a misunderstanding. It acknowledged that leadership failures had allowed misconduct to continue. That sentence cost him more emotionally than losing his title. My mother returned the company pin she had removed at dinner and asked that it be placed in the archives with a note explaining why she stopped wearing it. Grant contacted me twice. The first message called me a traitor. The second arrived after the court hearing that required him to repay a substantial portion of the diverted funds. He wrote, "You got what you wanted." I did not respond immediately. Then I sent one sentence. "What I wanted was for you to stop, and you refused every chance you were given." He never apologized to Liam. Instead, through our mother, he offered to purchase him an expensive computer. I declined. A gift offered to bypass accountability is not an apology. 6 months later, Grant pleaded guilty to offenses connected to falsified business records and misuse of grant-funded payments. His sentence included a period of home confinement, probation restitution, and a prohibition against serving as an officer of companies receiving public development funds. Some relatives complained that the punishment was too severe. Others said it was too lenient. I stopped measuring justice by whether everyone felt satisfied. The important facts were simpler. Grant no longer controlled employees he could intimidate. The stolen funds were being recovered, the museum was repaired, and the people he had blamed were publicly cleared. He had spent years building his identity around being the family's untouchable golden son. In the end, the heaviest consequence was not the lost title or lake house. It was being seen accurately. Nearly a year after the dinner, Liam and I returned to the Hawthorne Rail Museum for the opening of a youth engineering laboratory. The foundation had expanded his flood warning design with help from university students and emergency management specialists. 3 rural communities were testing updated versions of the device near drainage channels that regularly overflowed during heavy storms. Liam's name appeared on a small plaque beside the first prototype. He read it once, smiled, and immediately began showing another student how the sensor worked. He did not ask whether Grant would see it. He did not need the approval of someone who had tried to make him feel undeserving. My parents attended the opening, but our relationship was no longer built on pretending the past had disappeared. I had established boundaries before allowing them back into Liam's life. They could not use him to carry messages to Grant. They could not pressure him to forgive an apology he had never received. They could not dismiss cruel remarks as jokes or expect me to remain silent for the comfort of the family. My mother accepted the rules first. My father resisted, then slowly understood that boundaries were not punishment. They were the conditions required for trust to exist again. He apologized to me without adding excuses. He admitted that he had valued family harmony more than truth because harmony made him feel like a successful father. I kept asking the injured person to be quieter, he said, because confronting the person causing the injury would have forced me to admit I had failed. It was the most honest thing he had ever told me. I did not promise instant forgiveness. Real forgiveness is not amnesia, and reconciliation is not an obligation. I told him we could build something new, but we could not return to what existed before. That structure had been unsafe. My mother began meeting with a family therapist on her own. She recognized that praising Grant had become a part of her identity. His achievements reassured her that she had raised an exceptional child, so she interpreted every criticism of him as criticism of herself. Understanding that pattern did not erase the harm, but it made change possible. Ethan and I rebuilt our relationship too. We compared years of stories and discovered how frequently Grant had kept us apart with small lies. He told me Ethan resented my education. He told Ethan I considered field engineers inferior. Neither statement had been true. Isolation had been one of Grant's most effective tools because people who do not compare experiences are easier to control. Mercer Civic Development survived, but it became a different company. Under Marisol's leadership, it repaid the public funds, completed the museum repairs, and published an external compliance report. My father's name remained on the company, but the family no longer possessed automatic executive authority. Relatives could apply for positions only through the same process as other candidates. I remained independent and declined a permanent board seat. For most of my life, I thought reclaiming my place in the family business would prove Grant had not defeated me. Eventually, I realized I did not need his old throne. I had built a respected career precisely because I left. My own firm expanded, and I created a small internship program for young people interested in ethical engineering and public accountability. Daniel and I met twice after he apologized. We forgave each other as much as we could, but we did not restart our relationship. Some doors closed because of deception, and learning the truth does not always restore what time has changed. That was painful, but it was also freeing. I no longer needed every loss to be reversed before I could move forward. As for Grant, he remained distant from most of the family. He attended counseling as part of his probation and eventually sent Liam a handwritten letter. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It admitted that excluding him from the meal had been deliberate and that the intention was to diminish his achievement. Liam read it, placed it in a drawer, and said he was not ready to respond. I told him he never had to respond unless doing so felt right to him. Children should not be trained to surrender their boundaries merely because an adult finally admits wrongdoing. After the laboratory opening, we ate dinner at the museum cafe. The menu was simple burgers, soup, grilled cheese, and slices of pie. Liam ordered a hot dog. I asked whether the choice bothered him. He grinned and said, "It's food, Mom." Uncle Grant was the problem. His answer stopped me. For months, I had viewed that hot dog as a symbol of humiliation. Liam refused to let Grant own it. He ate every bite, then ordered apple pie. That evening taught me the final lesson of our story. Breaking a toxic family cycle is not about winning the loudest confrontation. It is about refusing to pass the injury forward. It means protecting children without teaching them hatred, demanding accountability, without becoming cruel, and recognizing that silence can be as damaging as the abuse it shelters. Family loyalty should never require someone to accept humiliation. Peace that depends on one person swallowing pain is not peace, it is obedience. I once believed strength meant enduring everything without complaint. Now I know strength can sound like one calm word, noted spoken at the exact moment you decide the pattern ends with you. My announcement did not destroy our family. It exposed what had already been destroying us. The truth cost us titles, money, relationships, and illusions, but it gave Liam something far more valuable, proof that his dignity was not negotiable. And it gave me back the voice I had surrendered years earlier. So here's the question I still think about. When protecting the family requires sacrificing the most vulnerable person at the table, what exactly are we protecting? Sometimes the bravest act is not forgiving immediately or keeping everyone together. Sometimes it is standing up, telling the truth, and allowing consequences to enter the room.